King's Gambit vs E captures f4. Part 3. White pawn to e4. Black pawn to e5. White pawn to f4. Black pawn captures white pawn on f4. White knight from g1 to f3. Black pawn to d6. White pawn to d4. Black pawn to g5. White pawn to h4. Black pawn to g4. White knight from f3 to g1. Black bishop to h6. White knight from b1 to c3. Black knight from b8 to c6. White knight from g1 to e2. Black pawn to f3. White knight from e2 to f4. Black queen to f6. White knight from c3 to d5. Black queen captures white pawn on d4. White knight captures black pawn on c7 check. Black king to d8. White queen captures black queen on d4. Black knight captures white queen on d4. White knight captures black rook on a8. Black knight captures white pawn on c to check. White king to f2. Black knight captures white rook on a1. White bishop to d3. Black pawn captures white pawn on g2. White king captures black pawn on g2. Black knight from g8 to f6. White bishop to e3. Black bishop to d7. White bishop to d4. Black king to e7. White bishop captures black knight on f6 check. Black king captures white bishop on f6. White knight to d5 check. Black king to e5. White knight from a8 to c7. Black rook to c8. White rook captures black knight on a1. Black pawn to f5. White pawn captures black pawn on f5. Black bishop to c6. White rook to e1 check. Black king to d4. White bishop to e4. Black rook captures white knight on c7. White knight captures black rook on c7. Black bishop captures white bishop on e4 check. White king to g3. Black bishop captures white pawn on f5. White rook to e7. Black bishop to c1. White knight to e8. Black bishop captures white pawn on b2. White knight captures black pawn on d6. Black bishop to g6. White king captures black pawn on g4. Black king to c5. White rook captures black pawn on b7. Black bishop to f6. White pawn to h5. Black bishop to d3. White rook to f7. Black bishop to e5. White knight to f5. Black pawn to a5. White rook captures black pawn on h7. Black bishop to e to check. White king to g5. Black bishop to c3. White rook to c7 check. Black king to b4. White pawn to a3 check. Black king to b3. White rook captures black bishop on c3 check. Black king captures white rook on c3. White pawn to h6. And after this move, black resigned.